So in the reading, Judith Butler discusses Friedrich Nietzsche in detail, and Butler critiques Nietzsche's writings on the genealogy of morals. For Nietzsche, writes Butler, the subject appears only as a consequence of a demand for accountability. A set of painful effects is taken up by a moral framework that seeks to isolate the cause of those effects in a singular intentional agent, a moral framework that operates through a certain economy of paranoid fabrication and efficiency. The question then of who is accountable for a given injury precedes and initiates the subject. And the subject itself is formed through being nominated to inhabit that grammatical and juridical site. So if we were to think about the nomination of subjects to inhabit juridical sites, then we can think about it in relation to crime. So the history of slavery has led to a whole series of processes of discrimination, including social alienation, psychological violence, preference for people whose bodies and facial features look a certain way in all areas of life. And then we come to the burning of the cross. So when someone burns a cross, this is seen to be an event. However, it is an event, an act of signification that involves a history of speakers. So the subject in this story of morality only exists when the subject is made to take responsibility or held accountable. But for Judith Butler, the subject's accountability and responsibility is bound to a whole set of discursive norms that are performatives, which are enacted from birth and lead to the illusion of a stable identity. So Butler further writes, in a sense, for Nietzsche, the subject comes to be only within the requirements of a moral discourse of accountability. The requirement of blame figure the subject as the cause of an act. In this sense, there can be no subject without a blameworthy act, and there can be no act apart from a discourse of accountability, and according to Nietzsche, without an institution of punishment. But here it seems that Nietzsche's account of subject formation in On the Genealogy of Morals exposes something of its own impossibility. For if the subject, in scare quotes, is first animated through accusation, conjured as the origin of an injurious action, then it would appear that the accusation has come from an interpolating performative that precedes the subject, one that presupposes the prior operation of an efficacious speaking. Who delivers that formative judgment? If there is an institution of punishment within which the subject is formed, is there not also a figure of the law who performatively sentences the subject into being? Is this not, in some sense, the conjecturing by Nietzsche of a prior and more powerful subject? So if we think about Judith Butler's critique of subject formation and accountability in relation to the example that the author gives of a young white man who burns a cross in America. The act of cross burning and the enactment of whiteness and masculinity as crime obviously involves a whole history of speakers. It involves an entire history of media representations. It involves a history and an ongoing system of policing that often exonerates white police officers who kill young Black people. Obviously, Judith Butler constantly reiterates that people who are victims of hate crime experience psychological violence, trauma, hardship, suffering, they have to move. And Judith Butler obviously sees the burning of crosses as a form of hatred that has material consequences. However, the idea of the punishment of a subject outside of processes of performativity that lead to subject formation is what Judith Butler is critical of. So what Butler's argument actually leads towards is a reconsideration of the Supreme Court ruling regarding free speech and free expression. That if we see cross burning as not just any act of expression, so if I was to uh, start a bonfire, it would not be the same as burning a cross in certain states in the United States of America in close proximity to Black people and specifically Black families. The cross burning exists as an utterance, a performative utterance in a long series of utterances that give the illusion of a stable, white, and often male American identity. Um, and so the point with Judith Butler, the point that I take from the article is that if we were to consider these acts of speech not in isolation or not as isolated acts of self-expression, but as involving a community of speakers and a history of speakers, we might consider them to be harmful on their own. However, now obviously, because of the nature of free speech and censorship, uh, there must be a proven intent to harm in the act of cross burning. And Judith Butler also grapples with the idea of censorship when talking about don't ask, don't tell policies uh, against participation of queer people in the military. So free speech obviously protects certain people. Um, and it protects people's right to self-expression. However, this enactment, say, of being queer in the military, does not exist outside of a history of speakers uh, and a history of laws that protect queer people. There are no laws protecting white supremacists. And so the problem is that if we see individual acts of signification as just speech acts, then we normalize a history of hate crime, and specifically a history of hate crime enacted by white supremacists against Black people. Race itself is a performative. And this is one of the most interesting things that I think we can think about in relation to Judith Butler's writing. If gender is performative, then is race also performative? Uh, this person has written an essay called Language and Gender, Nietzsche and Butler, which can be found online. And they write, okay, so Butler is going to utilize Nietzsche's insights on how language generates our blind embrace of the concept of substantial selfhood in her critique of the substantializing of gender, whereas Nietzsche attacked the metaphysics of substance for the sake of undermining the concept of self it produces. Butler is going to attack this type of metaphysics for how it substantializes and reifies gender identities. Gender is neither a substance nor an attribute that inheres in a substance. So gender is not something that is inherent in the self. It emerges through a whole series of performatives, including norms of socialization, ways in which we are taught to speak and act and think and be in the world that are not natural or innate. So is race also an attribute that is neither a substance nor an attribute that inheres in a person? And I would argue that race is also performative. So the enactment of racial extremes is part of a whole series of performatives where people do race from birth, and people do race in certain contexts. So cross burning and learning how to burn a cross would not make sense in other contexts. It is a specifically American phenomenon or ritual or act of hate speech that makes sense only in relation to the history of slavery. So many scholars who believe in the constructed nature of identity and whose work often touches on transgender and queer rights also write about the abolition of prisons and write about the ways that the criminal justice system makes examples out of poor people. So the first person who enacted a series of performatives that made them feel powerful, uh, white and male, was not a young American man who burned a cross. And the last person who will do this will not perhaps be a young white American man who burns a cross. The kind of pathologizing of the poor is similar to pornography. That Judith Butler's arguments about pornography is that pornography is often written about by feminist scholars as a form of misogyny and rape. However, the enactment of the exaggeration of gender roles in pornography is not the first instance where gender exists and where gender exists within a heterosexual matrix, where gender roles form the basis of sexual desire. So the point is not that cross burning just is right or that people should be allowed to commit crimes, but that the crimes themselves should not be thought of in isolation. And the criminal justice system often serves to isolate those who are poor and working class, who enact really vulgar performatives that are really an exaggeration of a set of norms that we all abide by and embody. So this is a clip of Dean Spade, who is a freedom scholar, and Spade's work also looks at or also involves radical approaches to society and to the criminal justice system and to social justice. So this is Dean Spade discussing his scholarship work and understanding of society as an academic and philosopher and legal scholar. Sorry, for some reason, sometimes the screen share pauses and I don't know.
What I want for everyone, and I think what my work is really toward is obviously to like get rid of these brutal systems that are chewing up our communities and caging people and make people live in brutal poverty. And while we're still working that out and people are still going through those systems, I want people to have accompaniment, to feel like a ton of people have their back, that they're not to blame for the stigma that's being placed on them. The only thing that matters to me in this lifetime is being part of work to reduce human suffering and destroy systems of domination. My name is Dean Spade, and I'm a freedom scholar.
So, if we were to think of systems of domination in relation to the criminal justice system, uh, then we're left with a whole series of ironies and incommensurable goals, in the sense that the criminal justice system is often used as an arbiter between different claimants, some of whom are minorities who are victims of crime. But what many abolition scholars would argue is that the criminal justice system is an agent of violence and systemic discrimination in the lives of many marginalized people, including people of color, women, and the poor. So if one is a victim of, say, hate speech or acts of hate crime, then I could potentially, if I was a victim of hate crime, I could turn to the criminal justice system to offer me some feeling of justice or uh, retribution or financial remuneration for my suffering. However, in many instances, what abolition scholars and scholars who are critical of the criminal justice system have argued is that it is possible for the victim of a hate crime to be further traumatized by the criminal justice system. And this is something that feminist criminologists have written about extensively when and feminist lawyers and legal scholars have documented when women report to have been sexually harassed or raped, or when people report that they have been victims of domestic violence, will they receive support, and will they feel that justice has been done, or will they be further traumatized by the criminal justice system? So Judith Butler's writings also involve a discussion regarding the history of speech acts. And I've mentioned this throughout the first part of the lecture, but in these specific passages, Butler grapples with this idea of individual and collective responsibility. In order to establish injurious consequence within the domain of accountability, it is necessary not only to install a subject, but also to establish the singularity and discreteness of the act itself, as well as the efficacy of the act to produce injury. Sorry, I'll read it again. In order to establish injurious consequence within the domain of accountability, is it necessary not only to install a subject, but to establish the singularity and discreteness of the act itself, as well as the efficacy of the act to produce injury? If the injury can be traced to a specific specifiable act, it qualifies as an object of prosecution. It can be brought to court and held accountable. But this tracing of the injury to the act of a subject and this privileging of the juridical domain as the site to negotiate social injury, does this not unwittingly stall the analysis of how precisely discourse produces injury by taking the subject and its spoken deed as the proper place of departure? So, what interests Judith Butler is this question of responsibility in the court of law, as opposed to responsibility for uh, processes of socialization and processes of systemic inclusion and discrimination that lead us to a context in which someone would burn a cross. So, hate speech is central to Butler's discussion of words that wound. And this article is part of a longer book called Excitable Speech, in which Judith Butler discusses the relationship between words and wounds. So the article is a really excellent philosophical text because it allows us to think of one issue from various social locations. So the possibility of censoring hate speech or censoring these actions or censoring the desire for collective mobilization of groups like the Ku Klux Klan is discussed alongside censorship of queer people in the military. That if we censor one group of people who wants to mobilize politically and wants to use certain speech to express themselves or to mobilize solidarity for their group, can we censor others? Judith Butler writes, defenders of hate speech prosecution have had to shift the analysis to acknowledge that agents other than governments and branches of governments wield the power to injure through words. Indeed, an analogy is set up between state action and citizen action, such that both kinds of actions are understood to have the power to deny rights and liberties protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Consequently, one obstacle that proponents of legislation against hate speech have discovered is that the state action doctrine qualifies recourse to the Equal Protection Clause in such instances, presuming as it does that only governments can be the agents of harmful treatment that results in a deprivation of rights and liberties. So the use of hate speech or the use of of violence by police is something that has been in the media for the last several years. The murder of George Floyd in the United States of America led to unprecedented levels of protest against uh, police murders of Black Americans. So, this language of hate speech divides citizens from the state. And in prosecuting individual citizens using the state, does the state then gain more authority to kill? So if the state is the set of institutions or the state is the kind of overarching power that has the right to grant me rights and take my rights from me, then does this mean that the state also has the right to enact what could be hate crime against me? In many cases, the answer is yes. That the police can enact what could be termed hate crimes against the public, although it would never be called hate crimes in police reports in courts of law. It would be called policing. So Judith Butler then discusses performativity and the relationship between speech and the formation of a self in the article. The subject as sovereign is presumed in the Austinian account of performativity, the figure for the one who speaks and in speaking performs what she or he speaks, is the judge or some other representative law. A judge pronounces a sentence, and the pronouncement is the act by which the sentence first becomes binding. As long as the judge is a legitimate judge and conditions of felicity are properly met. If performativity requires a power to effect or enact what one names, then who will be the one with such power? And how will such a power be thought? How might we account for the injurious word within such a framework? The word that not only names a social subject, but constructs that subject in naming and constructs that subject through a violating interpolation. So Butler's article really asks us to consider who is in a position to judge and who is this person or who is this subject that is granted the power to judge others? And is this person or set of institutions or occupations a set of institutions or persons that exists outside of a history of speakers? And the answer is obviously no, that um, in making judgments of guilt or innocence, the law exists often outside of or apart from those whom it accuses and judges. And uh, if we were to think about this in relation to race, what I would argue is that in many instances, in cases that involve race, cases of law, cases of crime, what sets apart a judge from a criminal is class. That's the example that Judith Butler gives is of this young American man who burned a cross, a young white American man who burned a cross. But the kind of very angry vilification of the working class is often what interpolates the middle class into being, and the middle class white person who enacts a whole set of performatives to stand apart from the middle class, or stand apart, sorry, from the poor or working class white person. The same is true of gender and masculinity, and the example is pornography, that what often distinguishes someone who sees themselves as a middle class gendered subject from a working class gendered subject is the sense of innocence and appeals to the law, the defense of one's personhood and property using the law rather than fear of the criminal justice system. So, throughout the class, I will discuss race, ethnicity, and crime from a Marxist perspective. Judith Butler further asks these questions. Is it the power of a one, in scare quotes, to effect such an injury through the wielding of the injurious name? Or is that a power accrued through time, which is concealed at the moment that a single subject utters its injurious terms? Does the one who speaks the term cite the term, thereby establishing his or herself as the author, while at the same time establishing the derivative status of that authorship? So, what's really interesting in this article is thinking about who owns speech acts. So, when one burns a cross, are they the sole owner of this process of signification? Yes, in the sense that they can and I believe should be held accountable in law. So that if one burns a cross and it is proven that they intended to intimidate or harm people of color in the state that they live, then yes, I think they should face criminal charges. However, how do they know how to burn a cross? How does someone learn this process of signification? How does one learn a language? And if we were to think about how one learns a language of gender, how do you learn to speak in a certain tone of voice if you are a woman? Gender is not just one act that someone teaches someone, and there's no recourse to law. I mean, if you wanted to take your parents to a court of law because you feel as though you were raised to be sweet and nice, and you were not raised to be aggressive and competitive, um, you have no recourse to law. The process of socialization begins from birth. Race is also perhaps a very localized idea and set of performatives that begins from birth. The problem with crime is that crime is often the most extreme enactment of forms of microaggression and minute antagonism between people that exist in the lives of every person who is not a criminal. So the most extreme enactment of gender roles often justify the killing of women and cisgender women by men. The most extreme enactment of gender and sexual norms justify hate crimes against the transgender and queer community. And the most extreme enactment of race will involve groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the burning of crosses. These are people who will go to jail. They will be criminalized. They will be referred to by middle class people as subjects that are worthy of scorn and condemnation, ridicule and contempt. They are people who speak only because they are part of a history of speakers. Is the community and history of such speakers, writes Judith Butler, not magically invoked at the moment in which that utterance is spoken? And if and when that utterance brings injury, is the utterance or the utterer who is the cause of the injury? Or does that utterance perform its injury through a transitivity that cannot be reduced to a causal or intentional process originating in a singular subject? So I want to focus on the last sentences. Does that utterance perform its injury through a transitivity that cannot be reduced to a causal or intentional process originating in a singular subject? So, if we were to think about the burning of the cross, does burning a cross perform an injury that cannot be reduced to a causal or intentional process originating in a singular subject? The answer is obviously yes, in the sense that if I was just to burn a whole series of papers, it wouldn't mean anything. The cross only signifies as terrifying and as an act of war because of an entire process of signification that involves cross burning and that involves hate speech, and the history of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States of America. This does not mean that individual groups or actors should not be held accountable for, but from the perspective of social justice and academics who are often interested in nonviolence and interested in the development of a more ethical society, then criminalizing individual acts or events is not going to change a context in which we have all been exposed to a language of race and a language of crime uh, that often involves really vulgar uses of objects and words to threaten people of color. So I'll finish by discussing burning crosses. Burning crosses is the form of hate speech or the signification of hatred that Judith Butler focuses on in this essay. Cross burning is one of many atrocities uh, enacted against Black people and other people of color by white supremacists. So, in modern times, cross burning or cross lighting is a practice which is associated with the Ku Klux Klan. However, it was practiced long before the Klan's inception. Since the early 20th century, the Klan burned crosses on hillsides as a way to intimidate and threaten Black Americans and other marginalized groups. In Scotland, the fiery cross, known as the Crantera, was used as a declaration of war. So the cross burning is terrifying because it was once a declaration of war and perhaps still is. The figure of burning will be repeated throughout the opinion, first in the context in which the burning cross is construed as the free expression of a viewpoint within the marketplace of ideas, and second, in the example of the burning of the flag, which could be held illegal were it to violate an ordinance prohibiting outside fires, but which could not be held to be illegal if it were the expression of an idea. The stripping of Blackness and family from the figure of the complainant is significant, for it refuses the dimension of social power that constructs the so-called speaker and the addressee of the speech act in question, the burning cross. So this takes us back to race. And what interests Judith Butler is that removing cross burning from a history of speakers also refuses to consider that the people who are being forced to bear witness to the burning cross are Black Americans, and in many cases, Black American families. So, this kind of neutrality refuses as well the racist history of the Convention of Cross Burning by the Ku Klux Klan, which marked, targeted, and hence portended a further violence against a given addressee. So the further violence can only be thought of as further violence if we embody these people as predominantly white men who are involved in the Ku Klux Klan, who often use these acts of hatred against Black families. That the cross burns and thus constitutes an incendiary destruction is not considered as a sign of the intention to reproduce that incendiary destruction at the site of the house or the family. The historical correlation between cross burning and marking a community, a family, or an individual for further violence is also ignored. How much of that burning is translatable into a declarative or constitutive proposition? And how would one know exactly what constitutive claim is being made by that burning cross? If the cross is the expression of a viewpoint, is it a declaration as in, I'm of the opinion that Black people ought not to live in this neighborhood, or even I'm of the opinion that violence ought to be perpetrated against Black people? So Butler's article is really interesting because the author discusses or is interested in asking these questions as to whether acts of aggression, like the burning of the cross, can be read as speech. So, in the Supreme Court ruling, the First Amendment is upheld, and the First Amendment is the right of religious expression and freedom of speech. So, can the cross burning be thought of as an act of speech, as an act of, say, white Christians expressing themselves? And Judith Butler questions whether or not um, this act of hate speech or this act of group aggression, which is historically situated or which is given meaning because of a whole history of white supremacy, could be seen as an individual act of speech or expression. So Butler then compares or uses the example of pornography. And what interests Judith Butler in many articles as a scholar who writes extensively about language and the body and language and intention is often the ways that individual people are not just acting with free will prior to being constructed as a certain subject. So, action for Judith Butler and identity for Judith Butler, the body itself for Judith Butler, does not exist outside of language and outside of processes of socialization and processes of punishment and discipline that force a subject to perform under certain sides. However, this does not mean that one is not culpable under the law, that the enjoyment of certain privileges like masculinity or whiteness obviously causes one to participate in certain social rituals and uh, institutions. However, these individual actions do not exist outside of a whole set of linguistic norms and societal norms uh, that produce the subject. So, Butler's discussion of pornography and questioning the relationship between pornography and hate speech is really interesting because Judith Butler is interested in the ways that pornography often involves an exaggeration of gender norms that we are all familiar with and participate in. And by giving us the most extreme example of, say, heterosexual sex, uh, what pornography does is to exaggerate existing norms. So Judith Butler writes the imperative do this is less delivered than depicted. And if what is depicted is a set of compensatory ideals, hyperbolic gender norms, then pornography charts a domain of unrealizable positions that hold sway over the social reality of gender positions, but do not, strictly speaking, constitute that reality. Indeed, it is their failure to constitute it that gives the pornographic image the phantasmatic power that it has. In this sense, to the extent that an imperative is depicted and not delivered, it fails to wield the power to construct the social reality of what a woman is. This failure, however, is the occasion for an allegory of such an imperative, one that concedes the unrealizability of the imperative from the start, and which finally cannot overcome the unreality that is its condition and its lure. My call, as it were, is for a feminist reading of pornography that resists the literalization of the imaginary scene, one which reads it instead for the incommensurabilities between gender norms and practices that it seems compelled to repeat without resolution. So, this kind of enactment of exaggerated norms and the actual reality of gender is perhaps similar to crimes that involve race. Despite cross burning by the Ku Klux Klan has not stopped the existence of many middle class and very wealthy people of color from living in America. And cross burning has not stopped the election of the Vice President of the United States of America, Kamala Harris. Um, this kind of exaggeration and the actual norms that one lives with uh, are also then acts of speech or expression that are extreme and that draw our attention to the ongoing workings of race and gender. The article is really philosophically dense, and it is part of an entire book written by Judith Butler called Excitable Speech. If you're interested in doing a presentation for the presentation component of the course about Judith Butler's article, you might consider looking at this book, Excitable Speech. Judith Butler's writings, I think, are really interesting to consider now because of the debates on university campuses regarding free speech. Speaking is not simply speaking for Judith Butler, who begins with J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words. When we speak, we act. And when we speak, we act as ourselves, but we also act for and against others. So speech is also injury. The burning of the cross is not just an act in and of itself, it is the enactment of racial hatred and white supremacy against and for others. So to speak is also to act. Therefore, we cannot really ever speak freely because we are also acting for and against others. And we are also acting as ourselves. And this enactment of the self only exists because of a whole series of performatives that we have been socialized to enact since birth. So I'll finish with this quote by Judith Butler. To operate within the matrix of power is not the same as to replicate uncritically relations of domination. So one can operate within a history of race in North America without uncritically replicating or repeating vulgar forms of hate crime, such as the burning of crosses. So that is the first lecture, and that is part one and part two. When I post the slides online, you'll find that there is actually a clip about the history of cross burning that you are free to watch. And that is the first lecture for this week. I will post the assignment guidelines online, and then I will send you a Zoom link. So we can have an optional meeting next week. And if you choose to, you can join me over Zoom next week, and we can discuss the assignment guidelines and presentation guidelines and any questions you have about the course. Um, as mentioned, the entire course is asynchronous, which means you can watch the recorded lectures and submit your work online. And if you would like to have a synchronous meeting, you can attend one of the optional synchronous classes, or you can contact me and we can meet in person, or we can meet over Zoom one-on. Okay. That is all. I hope you are doing well, and I hope you enjoy this course and the rest of your studies. Thank you. Bye-bye.